Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm Dr. Nikki Berry, an assistant professor at St. Martin's University. I've been a nurse for the past 8 years, and while my experience is primarily in geriatric, palliative, operating room, and trauma nursing, my research focuses on perinatal loss, grief, and bereavement, specifically from the perspective of the parent. I'm a Life Perspectives certified course instructor, and I sit on the Life Perspectives Healthcare Task Force. I'm also the founder of Project Poppyseed, a nonprofit organization dedicated to breaking the silence of perinatal loss and supporting parents, families, communities, and healthcare professionals amidst the anguish of perinatal loss. Thank you for taking this course with me today. This is a very important topic, and I would like to acknowledge and honor each of you because the work that you're doing, it's a very, very difficult job. And the fact that you're here learning about how to support parents during this difficult journey truly speaks to your heart for them. So thank you for joining me. As we go through the course today, I am going to be referencing my notes just to make sure I don't forget anything. And in this course, we're going to achieve the following outcomes. So in regards to perinatal loss following a life-limiting fetal condition, you will be able to describe the role of the healthcare professional as an advocate for parents throughout their perinatal loss journey. You will be able to apply the concepts of an ontological death and of paradox to the perinatal loss experience, and you will be able to demonstrate a compassionate, value-free, communicative stance when you are caring for parents who have experienced perinatal loss. I would like to note that I do not have any conflicts of interest to disclose. Before we get started, I want to give you a little bit of background about who I am and where I came from, because I really feel that that sets the stage for what I'm going to be bringing to you today. On January 4th, 2016, my sister and her husband learned at their 20-week ultrasound appointment that their first child was a little girl, and that their little girl had anencephaly. Now, anencephaly is a life-limiting fetal condition in which the neural tube does not form by the 28th day of gestation. This condition, likely the baby will not survive birth. If they do, they will not survive long after. Now, when my sister told me about her daughter's diagnosis, I instantly went into my nursing brain. I was used to identifying a problem and solving a problem. So as I drove down to visit my sister that evening, I was going through all of the options and the different things I was going to do to help her. In my brain, I automatically assumed that she was going to want to terminate the pregnancy and try to get pregnant again as soon as she was able. And so this is the plan I was ready to carry out for her. Then when my sister opened the door, I am not an emotional person, but I burst into tears. We just cried in each other's arms for I don't even know how long. Once we were able to really talk to each other, to this day, I'm so grateful that the question that came out was not what I intended to ask. It was not, when do you plan to terminate? It was, what do you plan to do? And I'm so grateful that this is how the question came out, because my sister's response really surprised me. She and her husband had decided that they wanted to carry their daughter to term, and they wanted to donate her organs to try to save other parents the same pain they were experiencing. She also asked me to be her advocate and her resource, and tasked me with carrying out her wishes. Now, at the time, I had a master's degree. I was working in the operating room. I had assisted with a number of organ procurements, and I was confident I could carry out her wishes. However, as time progressed, I encountered one roadblock after another. I was shocked to see how alone parents are in their experience and how many barriers there are to really receiving the care that these parents need. Thankfully, when this all did work out. However, it was not until my sister was in active labor 18 weeks later that I got the phone call saying that there was someone who would accept my niece's body for research. Now, it was a great comfort to my sister, her husband, and our whole family to know that my niece's life would count for something and that it would be more than the diagnosis she did not survive. This experience taught me many things. One of the things it taught me is how alone parents are through this experience and how few resources are available. Because of that, when I went on to get my doctorate degree, I dedicated my research to perinatal loss, grief, and bereavement, specifically from the parent's perspective following a life-limiting fetal condition like anencephaly. As my research progressed, I was so humbled and amazed by the resilience of these parents and the love and the joy that were in these heartbreaking stories. It's really caused me to pause and reflect on my own assumptions of what it means to have a pregnancy complicated by a life-limiting fetal condition. And so because of this, I invite you to take part in this course and to challenge your own assumptions about perinatal loss as I've learned to challenge mine. Because it's so much more than a diagnosis, I have learned. And you may be wondering, where did the term Project Poppyseed come from? So when my sister and her husband found out that they were having a baby, it was a time in the pregnancy when the fetus was the size of a poppy seed. They didn't want to call their little one it until they learned the gender of their child, and so because she was the size of the poppy seed, she naturally became their little poppy seed. And because she's the inspiration for my research, I found it only fitting to name my endeavors after her. Before we get too involved in the course materials, I want to review what you learned from the reproductive grief care course that you took leading into this. I also will review several definitions that I will be using throughout the course and just give you a brief refresher on normal grief responses versus complicated grief. Now, in the reproductive care course, you learned that perinatal loss is much more prevalent than most people assume. 1 in 4 pregnancies end in loss. In 2020, 2.4 million pregnancies ended in loss. You learned that reproductive loss is an emotionally meaningful experience and that parents need very holistic, emotional, spiritual, and psychosocial care in addition to the physical care that they receive. In learning about perinatal grief, which follows perinatal loss, you learned about the perinatal grief scale, and that there are several measurement tools that can be used to assess parents' grief intensity. And in learning that, you learned that partners carrying the pregnancy and the supporting partners, which we will touch on later, experience grief intensity at different time frames within that experience. You also learned about different theories to describe what the experience of perinatal loss is. And one of these that I will be revisiting in this course is Worden's tasks of grieving. Now, the tasks of grieving include processing the pain of loss, adjusting to a world without the deceased, finding an enduring connection with the deceased. In the reproductive grief care course, you also learned about the reproductive story. That is the story we tell ourselves about how many children we'll have one day and what our future families will look like. Now, we all have this, and it begins at a young age. Mine probably began when I was 8 or 9 years old. I was going to have 3 little boys. They were going to love playing baseball, and I was going to go to every single baseball game that they had. As we grow and have more life experiences, our reproductive stories change. My story changed as well. I don't have any little boys, but I'm very excited to watch my nephew play t-ball next year. One thing that our reproductive stories do not hold is loss. When we imagine having a family one day, we do not imagine having a pregnancy that ends in loss. And because of this, we are not prepared for when it happens. And lastly, I really want to remind you of the deep emotional, psychosocial, and spiritual impact of that perinatal loss. In the reproductive grief care course, really perinatal loss in general was discussed. In this course, I'm specifically going to be discussing reproductive loss from a life-limiting fetal condition and how that type of loss is unique in the perinatal loss experience. Now let's review some definitions. So when I talk about loss, I'm talking about the experienced absence of a possession or a person. And it's important to remember that the value of that which is lost is unique to and determined by the individual experiencing the loss. Now, before you try to write down all of these definitions verbatim, you have been given a handout in your course materials with these definitions in place. Now, grief is the emotional response to a loss. It's a very personalized feeling, and it's either in response to an actual perceived or an anticipated loss. Mourning is the outward social expression of that loss. It's how one demonstrates to others that they are grieving. Now, this process of mourning is very individualized as well, and it's highly influenced by culture and by social norms. Now, bereavement refers to the process of having experienced a loss, and it entails both that grief and the mourning. So it's the inner feelings and outward expression of the loss. The bereavement period refers to the time that it takes to grieve, mourn, and adjust to a world without the physical, psychological, and social presence of the deceased. And this bereavement period is a very, very individualized time frame. The perinatal period refers to any time between conception and 28 days after life. And when I'm talking about perinatal loss in general, I'm referring to this perinatal period. Now, perinatal loss can occur for a number of reasons, such as stillbirth, miscarriage, termination, or a life-limiting fetal diagnosis. Now, miscarriage is that fetal death that's occurring before 20 weeks gestation. And as you can see from the pie chart on the slides, 17% of perinatal loss cases are attributed to miscarriage. Now, stillbirth is that fetal death occurring after that 20 weeks gestation, and that accounts for approximately 10% of perinatal loss. Termination is the purposeful interruption of the intrauterine development process and accounts for around 17% of pregnancy loss. And finally, congenital anomalies are a wide variety of structural and functional abnormalities that result in a disrupted intrauterine development. This can be minor, such as like a minor cleft palate, or it could be life-limiting, as in the case of anencephaly, where the cranial spheres do not fully develop. Life-limiting congenital anomalies account for approximately 20% of perinatal loss cases. So when I'm talking about these life-limiting conditions, typically they are going to be one of these congenital anomalies. Now let's talk a little bit more about grief. So remember, grief is a normal emotional response to a loss. Individuals enter a state of bereavement following loss, which is that outward expression, the mourning, and the inner feelings, or grief. Now, a normal grief response is one that does not overwhelm an individual's ability to cope in their given role, meaning that the grief experienced from a loss should not be so catastrophic that an individual can no longer function. It's normal to have the daily life and routine interrupted, but not to a point that someone needs to have intervention of some sort. So in Warden's tasks of adjusting to a world without the deceased, that's a manageable transition in the grief. And I just really want to emphasize the importance and the normal aspect of grief following a loss, particularly perinatal loss. The reason I want to emphasize this is because prior to 1970, the emotional impact of pregnancy was not widely recognized by the healthcare system. Unfortunately, because it wasn't widely recognized, many individuals following pregnancy loss were simply told to go home and attempt to conceive again, and the meaning of the pregnancy and the emotional response to that pregnancy was not acknowledged. Thankfully, in 1970, Kennel et al. Were able to document and publish cases of perinatal grief following loss. This has led to a proliferation of research in perinatal loss, grief, and bereavement in the last 50 years. While we have learned so much, there is still so much to be learned. One of these things we did learn, however, is that in perinatal loss, up to 25% and even as many as 75% of individuals experience complicated grief. Now, complicated grief is not a normal response. It is a preventable adverse outcome following perinatal loss. This occurs when an individual's previously established coping mechanisms are outstripped by the emotional nature following that loss. Because the loss of a spouse, a friend, or a parent are so different than the loss of a pregnancy or a baby, people are not really equipped to know how to cope with that type of a loss. And that's when this complicated grief can develop. So complicated grief is characterized by a number of adverse biopsychosocial outcomes, including depression, anxiety, substance misuse, post-traumatic stress disorders, suicidality, cancer, obesity, hypertension, and even premature death. So this is a very, very poor outcome that up to 3/4 of parents experience following perinatal loss. So again, thank you for taking this course so that you can be an advocate for those going through this experience and help to mitigate that adverse reaction. Studies have shown that individuals who do not have a strong social support system are at a much higher risk of developing intense grief. And they have also found that social support and a lack thereof is directly associated with complicated grief. Now finally, we're going to just refresh you about one last thing in the reproductive grief care course that you learned, and that is the difference in grieving patterns of the partner carrying the pregnancy versus the supporting partner. So in that course that you took, you learned that from a specific study looking at cisgender men and women in heterosexual relationships, there was the perinatal grief scale, which measured the grief intensity of the partner carrying the pregnancy and the supportive partner. And that study found that the partners carrying the pregnancy tend to experience more intense grief initially, with a decrease in grief intensity over the next few years, while the supporting partners, while they did not experience intense grief initially, their grief intensified over the years, peaking 1 and 2 years following the loss. Now this is important to remember because the supporting partners are often marginalized and their grief tends to not be addressed. This not addressing grief leads to disenfranchised grief. And while reproductive loss is already a disenfranchised grief because many do not understand, the supportive partner is further disenfranchised, and it's just important to remember that they are an important person in this journey. So up next, we're going to talk more about how life-limiting fetal conditions are a unique subset within the perinatal loss experience.